All right, welcome everybody. It's great to see all of you joining us today. Um, in case you weren't here for our first webinar, this is our pre-eval webinar series. Pre-eval is an introductory webinar series. We're going to do about one a month and aim to have 8. And we're going to go over the basics of what you need to know to sort of start getting evaluation rolling in your organization. So if you did miss that first webinar, I'm going to put a link to a temporary link that we have on YouTube for it that might move later to a Moodle website that we're setting up. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but I'll share the link with you. If you watch all 8 webinars, you can receive a certificate of completion. And yeah, so if you can watch all 8 of those, and as well, I'm seeing some questions about muting. You are all muted as webinar. This is a webinar format, so nobody's going to be able to put their camera or microphone on. But if you do have questions or comments as we go along, we might ask you to type some things in the chat. Please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function to connect with us. So today we're going to focus on when the best time to start planning your evaluation is so that you can set up your evaluation program for success. So we're going to get into some of the pieces that kind of we look for when we start planning an evaluation. We'll talk in a bit more detail about each of these in later webinars, but for now what we're going to do is give you kind of a broad strokes overview and discuss why it might be important to consider this in the program. I myself am Kirsty Keys. I am a PhD student with the Evaluation Capacity Network at the University of Alberta. We, of course, are running this webinar series with the Alberta Mentoring Partnership, and today we are joined by Janae, who is also in the Evaluation Capacity Network, and Jason Daniels, also in the Evaluation Capacity Network, and Lori Chung, who's going to speak to us about her experiences starting an evaluation and learning about evaluation. So she'll provide us a nice case example. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jason. I think, maybe not. Nope, that's still me. All right. So today, like I said, we're going to talk about planning your evaluation and making it systematic, habitual process. We're going to touch on an overview of the key pieces of the evaluation plan. And throughout the pre-eval sessions, we'll get into more detail about those. But today we're really talking about focusing on the benefits of starting to think about and plan each step of your evaluation when you first start your program, rather than after you've had your program running for a while. It's important to kind of remember that planning a program and planning an evaluation, they're not mutually exclusive, but instead they're really actually closely related. And I think you'll get a pretty good sense of that today. Integrating evaluation into your program planning rather than a separate activity can help you make it more of a habit and something that runs a little bit more smoothly, doesn't require a whole bunch of extra resources, and is within your scope. And this also comes from having an organizational culture of evaluation and feedback. When your organization or program has a culture of gathering data and information and then using that to improve and demonstrate what's working, you'll find that the day-to-day program and the day-to-day evaluation are actually one and the same. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our next webinar on December 15th, 12 to 1 p.m. Registration for that is open. But for now, things we'd like to highlight that by making an evaluation a habitual and systematic process in your organization, you'll get more of an intentional, meaningful, and in-depth findings from that evaluation. And yeah, it'll run more smoothly. So with that, now I will pass it on to Jason to get into a bit more of the types of evaluations.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirsty. So to give away the story, the title of our presentation was like when to start planning your program evaluation. The answer is now. The sooner you can start planning your program evaluation, the more effective it's going to be. And we're going to focus a lot today on kind of talking about starting your planning of evaluation as soon as possible, and if possible, at the very beginning of the planning of your program. If you're planning the evaluation alongside of it, you're going to be most, I think, or gain the most benefit from your evaluation. That being said, a lot of us have already started programs, and so we can't go back in time and restart the evaluation. So the answer is start where you're at sooner rather than later. And as Kirsty mentioned, one of the other things we're going to emphasize today is trying to make evaluation and evaluative thinking a systemic part of what you actually do as an organization, as an individual, constantly thinking about evaluation. And so to lead into that, or to start talking about that, what I want to do is I want to break down evaluation and talk about some different forms of evaluation. In our previous webinar, we talked a little bit about some of the anxiety that people often feel when they're engaging in evaluation, because a lot of us have been exposed to evaluation from very young ages. Um, Lots of these evaluations are rather high stakes in nature. We take tests, we apply to a program, we do these different types of things. All of those things involve some form of evaluation where we're being compared to either our peers or we're being compared to some particular ideal. One of the things we strived really hard in the first webinar was to talk about the fact that evaluation is that, but it's also much more than that. And I think if we just focus on that piece of evaluation, we're missing out on a lot of the benefit that can be derived from doing evaluation. So I want to just talk about 3 overall breakdowns of evaluation. And this is by no means a comprehensive description of all the different ways that we could do evaluation, but it's a nice way to think about 3 overarching approaches to evaluation. The first one we often talk about is something called summative evaluation, is kind of the root word suggests there. It's a summation. It's basically what we're doing with summative evaluation is we tend to be looking at whether or not we've accomplished what we said we were going to accomplish. So a lot of summative evaluations happen at the end of a particular process or a program, where we reflect back or we look back and say, okay, we said we were going to have this particular effect. Did that actually happen? And so, for example, a lot of us that are involved in applying for funding, some of those come with requirements of some form of a summative evaluation that we need to report back. Again, understandably, we said we were going to do something as a result of receiving this funding. Did we actually do it, and can we demonstrate that? So as part of that, then the focus of summative evaluation tends to be on the outcomes, right? What outcomes did we say we were going to do? How do we measure those? We describe successes or the lack thereof in terms of the goals that we had with respect to our evaluation. And we answer questions like, was the program effective? Did the program result in the desired outcomes or specified expectations that we had? And so, again, I think a lot of us have experienced with some form of summative evaluation, but that's not the only type of evaluation that we can engage in. I also want to talk a little bit about something called formative evaluation. And the way that I like to think about formative evaluation is about improvement. And whenever I'm doing a formative evaluation, the key questions I'm asking typically have something to do about improving, changing, finding ways to do things better. And so as a result of this, formative evaluation often happens when we institute some or implement some form of a change. So some of the things we're looking at here, like feasibility, is it actually like working like we thought it would work? Are there things that we need to change to make this better? So this could come at the end of a program, or it could come in the middle of a program. So formative, again, could come at pretty much any time, but as the slide suggests, usually around or at a point of some significant change. And so some typical questions that we might ask are, did the program make things better? How can I make the program better? How is it going to work? What improvements can I make in this particular process? So if y'all remember being back in university, lots of times the type of evaluation that students are able to participate in are summative evaluations that come at the end of the term. And I think we probably all, if you've been to university, remember or have experience with that. The challenge with that is it does give the instructor some sense of how the class went, but the students who are providing the feedback don't actually ever receive any of the benefit from their feedback that they provide. Sometimes, not all classes, but some classes will give like a mid-course evaluation, and it could be as simple as, tell me how things are going, right? What could I change to make things better? Now that would be an example of a formative evaluation where an instructor can actually change midstream to make changes in terms of how they're instructing the course or things that are going on to make things better for the students who happen to be in the course. Now, the end of course could be a formative evaluation, but not for the students who are participating in giving the feedback, but for future iterations of the class. So even something that seems summative on its nature could also have formative elements of it if the purpose is improvement. The third one I want to talk about is something called developmental. Developmental occurs at the beginning of often new programs. In many cases, when we're implementing something brand new, we actually don't know exactly what to expect. And as a result of this, it's really hard to say, did we achieve our goals? How can we make things better? Because we don't actually have any sense of where we should be or how things are going to turn out. And so what the developmental evaluation really is looking at real-time change and real-time feedback. So it helps, among other things, to reveal areas where we might need to rethink elements of our program. And so what you'll see with the developmental evaluation is really kind of a back and forth data collection, modification, data collection, modification, as we are building a program. And finally, so if we talk about all these three as kind of three overarching processes of evaluation, the reality is oftentimes, if we're talking about, for example, summative and formative, we have elements of both in an evaluation, and we don't have to just do one type of evaluation. We can have an evaluation that includes elements of all of these things. Typically developmental usually kind of goes by itself at first, but what we see with developmental evaluations is they can actually, once we start to gain some more information about a program, we can start to set up some formative elements and then perhaps some summative elements. And so even though we're kind of presenting them as unique, distinct things, there is a lot of overlap between these different pieces. The approach that we're going to sort of focus on tends to lean more towards formative and developmental evaluation rather than summative. But just to remind you again, it doesn't have to be all or nothing or just one or the other one. All right, Kirsty, if you want to advance me. Awesome. So if we're thinking about our particular programs and things that we want to evaluate, as I mentioned at the beginning, the key thing that we want to do is we want to start our planning for our evaluation as soon as possible, whenever that point is, right? If it's right now and the program's been running for 5 years, then that's fine. If you have the opportunity to design an evaluation as the program is just getting going, then that's great, and you'll have a little bit more flexibility to implement things like developmental or formative evaluation in those kinds of plans. Regardless of what sort of form of evaluation you tend to be favoring or is useful for the program you're initiating or the process that you're looking at, one of the first things that we need to do is we need to identify the stakeholders. We talked a little bit in the first webinar about who stakeholders are. And so just to think about wherever you happen to be right now, think about all of the different individuals and groups of individuals that play a role or have an interest in your program or your process. And part of this is helping us to understand key things. And so what we've got on the slide here are a couple key questions that you could ask yourself when thinking about who potential stakeholders are. For example, who do we need to talk to do things like enhance credibility, okay, or implement program change, or advocate for change, or to fund program expansion, program continuation, to authorize funding, to report back to funders. So those are kinds of things we want to think about as well as who are the people who are affected by the evaluation or the program. Who are the people who are involved in the operation of the program? Who are those who are going to use the findings in some particular way? So as you can see, we have stakeholders both in terms of people with lived experience, perhaps, but we also have people who may not have lived experience but have control over whether or not you receive funding, or who have control over a public perception of different types of things. And so we can take this out in sort of like look at this in terms of, I like to think of the sort of concentric circles of kind of expanding relationships with respect to our particular program. And as we think about all of these potentially influential individuals or groups of individuals, we want to be thinking about ways that we could potentially involve them. And not every single stakeholder has to be involved in every aspect of our evaluation. So just because someone might have a stake in our evaluation doesn't necessarily mean that I need to gather data in a survey from that particular individual or that group of individuals. It could be simply that I need to provide them with the feedback, or that I just talk to them as I'm designing the questions. But what I do by, again, having a systemic approach to thinking through who the stakeholders are, is I make sure that I'm talking, one, to the right people to get the data that I need to have the impact that I need to have. And what I hopefully will do by going through this process is identify and make sure that I'm providing opportunities for either feedback or for the dissemination of knowledge to all of the people that I need to make my program run as efficiently and effectively as possible. And that's really the ultimate goal of our evaluation, is to make sure that we're doing things the best way that we can. And so I could do the most wonderful evaluation, but if it just sits on my desk in a report and never makes it to the people who are making decisions, then it's kind of a waste of money. At the same time, I might have a wonderful plan, but if I ask the wrong people, I might not get the data that I actually need to make the significant improvements in the program that I want to make. And so that's, in a nutshell, kind of why I want to always be thinking about these key stakeholders and have those in my mind throughout every single stage of this particular evaluation, or any evaluation that you happen to be doing. So one of the activities that we often do when we are setting up evaluations is we'll engage in a process, and I kind of alluded to this, called stakeholder mapping. And really what stakeholder mapping is and it can be more or less visual, but it really is a visual representation of all of your stakeholders and their level of involvement in your particular project. In another way to just sort of phrase this, it's kind of like brainstorming. And really it is just brainstorming. And what we do, like when we're teaching evaluation, for example, we'll have our students sit down and actually map this out on a big piece of paper, like physically map this out, draw, for example, some quadrants, or we'll have them draw like a bunch of concentric circles, and we'll have them list out all of the potential stakeholders and try to map them out with respect to where they fit in their evaluation, right? So for example, are these people with lived experience? If they are, right, are those people that we need to make sure that we're getting information directly from? Are these people who control funding? Okay, well, okay, if they are, right, do we need data from them? If we don't need data from them, what form of data do we need to provide back to them so that they can make the decisions about continuing our funding or whatever the decision might happen to be? So this is a really useful process to start off an evaluation. And it's really kind of the first step that we encourage people to engage in. Again, how formally you do this is really up to you. I mean, again, depending on the program size, you may have like multiple stakeholder groups or individuals, or you could just have like 3 or 4. So it wouldn't always necessarily mean that you have to sit down and map out like 400 different people and place them where they go. But really the whole notion of this is, like, again, I'm going to harp on this the whole time. Make this a systematic process, that when you're starting a program, when you're thinking about evaluation, sit down and take some time to think through all of the potential stakeholders and what roles they play in your evaluation, and have that in front of you as you're doing your evaluation. And what you might find, for example, is this doesn't have to be a static document. As the program goes along, what you might find is that people shift in terms of their roles and the things that you might need to, or the ways in which you include them in your evaluation. In our 4th workshop, we're going to spend some time actually going through stakeholder mapping and doing this. So stay tuned. And if you're interested in actually going through the process of developing a stakeholder map, then make sure you tune into our 4th webinar. Hopefully that will be in January, Kirsty. Excellent.
January 10th. So you guys can mark that one for your calendars. Registration will open soon.
Awesome. So once we've got our stakeholders mapped, another key element in the process of developing an evaluation is developing something called the theory of change and a logic model. And to be honest with you, I feel like this is where a lot of people's eyes gloss over and their brains phase out when we start talking about theory of change and logic model. And it sounds very theoretical and less practical. The reality is it is a really useful process and keep harping on making your processes systematic and really engaging in a purposeful evaluation. What a theory of change is your explanation for what your program does, why it does it, and what you expect to happen as a result of what you're doing. And the logic model is the visual representation of that theory of change. I've worked with a number of organizations, wonderful organizations that do fantastic work, but when you ask questions about, so why do you do X? Sometimes the answer is, yeah, I don't know. We've always kind of done that, right? It seems like it's a really good thing to do. And where this becomes really apparent is when I'm helping set up an evaluation. And one of the questions that I ask is, well, because they say, we want to measure our impact. And I say, okay, so what do you expect the impact to be? Like, so when you're doing activity X, Y, and Z, what's the purpose of that? And what do you think is going to happen when you do those things? So if I'm providing a mentorship program, why? Like, so if I'm engaging in one-on-one mentorship with an individual, like, do I have a reason for what I'm doing there? And obviously you do have a reason, but it's making that explicit and being able to connect the dots and say, if I do this, then this is what I expect to happen. And this should then be the outcome of that particular activity, which is where, if I'm setting up an evaluation, makes it really nice, because then I can actually set that up and I can measure that and look and see whether that's happening. If it's in the case of a summative evaluation or a formative evaluation, I can look and see, is it happening to the degree that I want it to happen? And if not, what changes do I have to make to the process to make it work even better? And so that's where my theory of change and logic model comes in handy. And if you've engaged in any kind of program planning, you probably have, whether you called it a theory of change and logic model, you probably have engaged in some form of this particular process. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, what I've got here is a couple different examples of ways in which logic models can be set up. The top one there is a very kind of linear, hierarchical kind of process. I mean, my brain works really well with lines and boxes and stuff like that. So I love that kind of approach. It's not everybody's cup of tea though. The one on the bottom, this is a colleague of mine, Rebecca Gokert, came up with this one in a program that she was working on to take a more kind of visual approach to making the connection between different activities that are being engaged in and the expected outcomes, as a result of working through those. And it's kind of maybe hard to see on your screen, but basically she uses the kind of metaphor of the tree here, or the imagery of a tree, to explain the different pieces, right? That you've got roots here, and if you got those strong roots, then obviously it's going to lead to a healthy tree, which is going to create leaves and blossoms, and eventually, you're going to develop these fruits, and the long-term outcome then is apple pie. And so the whole point of this is, how do we get to the apple pie? And sort of backing it off all along there and making the connection between the different pieces. So for you in sort of developing this, part of this again is just systematically going back through the inputs, or the things that you provide, like the resources that you have available to you, the activities that you engage in, right? Whether that's workshops, mentorship opportunities, learning opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the stuff that you're doing. And then making the connection between the stuff that you're doing and what the expected outcomes are actually going to be, right? What do you think is going to happen in the short term, medium term, long term, and so forth. So along with our stakeholder mapping, our webinar number 4 will also be going through in more detail and giving you some opportunities to practice kind of theory of change and logic model development. So in following through the process, so we start off identifying our stakeholder groups. we develop some form of a theory of change or logic model where we systematically think through all of the stuff that we're doing and the expected outcomes as a result of doing those things. And then our third step in setting up our evaluations is coming up with an evaluation purpose and some evaluation questions. Now, an evaluation purpose, and I want to tie this back to the previous slide where we were talking about theory of change and logic models. A theory of change and a logic model typically is at the program level. And so when I'm setting up a theory of change, often what I'm doing is I'm setting it up for my entire program. An evaluation purpose may coincide with elements of my logic model, but it may not cover the entire logic model. And so you as an individual organization may do lots of different things and have lots of different activities that you engage in and have many expected outcomes. An evaluation could be big enough to cover all those things, or you might simply pick one thing or a couple things to focus in on. And so when you're planning an evaluation, part of this, and when we're thinking about this in sort of real life, you are the evaluation person or you've been asked to do an evaluation off the side of your desk, you may not have the resource capacity to do an evaluation of the entire organization at one particular point in time. So part of the evaluation purpose is really thinking through what is it that I really need to know at this moment in time. And so part of it is coming up with a very specific purpose and set of goals or goal that you have for this specific evaluation. So again, it may or may not cover the entire program at any one particular point in time. The evaluation questions that we're also coming up with are the overarching big questions that we're going to ask. These aren't, for example, the things that you're going to put on your survey if you do a survey, or the interview questions you're going to ask, but these are overarching questions that you're hoping to answer as a result of doing an evaluation. So if, for example, you've got a mentorship program that has moved recently to an online format, okay, the purpose of your evaluation might simply be how well is my online mentorship program functioning, right? So I'm not evaluating everything about my whole mentorship organization. I'm just evaluating the online shift in this one. And so some of my, my questions might be, are students or to what degree do individuals participating in the mentorship program feel supported, right? Or whatever it might be. So those could be my evaluation questions that might help me to answer my overarching evaluation purpose for this particular evaluation. Now, key thing here when we're going to ask is, so why develop these at the start of your program? Okay, well, part of this will help you then determine what information you need to either continue to develop your program or to improve your program as it runs. Another way you can think about this is it can help you to prepare to integrate your data collection directly in stuff that you're doing day to day, instead of adding on additional processes and having, like, again, we talked in webinar 1 about survey fatigue, and people are just sick to death of being surveyed. But if there's something already being done, we could just piggyback on that. Instead of having to implement a whole new process, we just integrate this into stuff that we're already doing as a part of our day-to-day work. And one of the examples I used last time was, like, if we've already got staff meetings that are taking place, instead of creating a whole new meeting to do an evaluation, what if we just dedicated 15 minutes at our staff meeting to have a conversation about how things are going and ways that we can improve things? That would be an example of a formative evaluation. And we're not adding more work, we're just tapping into something that we're already doing, and we're broadening the scope of things that we're talking about. And then set in reasonable scope. And one of the things that always is a challenge with evaluations is what we call scope creep, where we sit down and we're super excited about evaluation, and we're thinking about all the different things that we can gather data on and all the wonderful information that would tell us. But part of this it can get out of hand really quickly. And one of the things that can happen is we can start gathering data just for the sake of gathering data, in case one day it might be useful. One of the things that you really want to think about, again, especially in cases where you have limited capacity, is what is it that I actually need? And one of the things that I tend to try to do when I'm setting up evaluations is I think through all of the different questions I have And the information that I want to collect is this a need to know or is this a nice to know? And nice to know is great, but sometimes what I can do is just parking lot that. I can put that in the parking lot and say, you know what, if I have the resources and time at a future point, I'm going to come back to that. But right now, I need to know these three things. And so that's the data I need to focus on. And I don't want to sacrifice the quality of that data by throwing everything in the kitchen sink at people in the hopes of just getting this wide array of data that I might or might not use at one particular point in time. And so again, part of the systematic process is thinking through what's need to know and what's nice to know in terms of my data collection. Part of the process here again is thinking through, what do I already have? A lot of organizations collect a lot of data, and probably a lot of you have like your own intake forms and you've got other types of things that you're engaging in already. All of this could be useful data. And so part of this might be, before you actually engage in any new processes, look through what you're already collecting and the processes that you're already engaging in. Okay, it could be you're already collecting the data you need to be able to answer the questions you have. If so, fantastic, great. Maybe make a plan to do a more systematic approach or engage in a more systematic approach to use that data. It could be maybe we're collecting close to the right data and all I need to do is tweak the questions I'm asking and then all of a sudden I've got the right data I have. Once you go through that inventory, then what you can do is look at the holes left in the data that you need versus what you're collecting. And that's where you can focus your sort of new evaluation processes on is, okay, so I don't have information to answer this particular question. So what can I do to answer this question, right? So look for those gaps. What data do you need to fill those gaps? What's the most efficient process that I can use to gather that data? Are we already doing something that I could piggyback on? Add a question, add a 5 minutes to an existing meeting. Will that allow me to answer the questions I have? And if so, great. It's not like you have to engage in a whole brand new, expensive, time-consuming process. If you're already collecting the data that you need, or you already have processes in place, and all you need to do is tweak those processes, then that's a much more efficient way of engaging in an evaluation. Once we've gathered all the data, the other piece, and if we go back all the way back to where we started today in terms of our stakeholder mapping, one of the things we also need to be thinking about, and it's useful, I find, to have this in mind at the very beginning of an evaluation, is two things, well, a number of things, but two major things I want to talk about. With whom are we planning to share this information? And how am I going to share that information with individual stakeholder groups? If I'm reporting back to family members, it's probably going to be more effective to use a different format than if I'm reporting back to a funding body or a funding agency. They both probably need different information provided in different ways. And so if I could think about that at the beginning of my evaluation, I'm probably going to be more effective at the latter end of my evaluation. I always, when I start my evaluations, try to think about and imagine that I've done all of the data collection and analysis, and now I'm reporting this data. What is it that I want to be able to say to these different groups, right? So if I think about a family committee or whatever, how do I want to present the data, right? Am I going to be going and presenting face to face with those individuals? Am I going to create an infographic for those individuals? If I know that I've already got funding requirements, well, I want to make sure that I'm collecting the right data in the proper form to be able to provide them the information that they need. So findings can be used for lots of things: informing stakeholders of impact, informing program function design, making improvements. So match the knowledge mobilization techniques with the stakeholders that we have. Now, the caution, the word of caution I will put in there is sometimes we as evaluators try to do too much, and we can't always be all things to all people. And so sometimes there will also have to be kind of a triaging or a prioritization process that takes place in terms of how many and to what individuals can I provide this information to, and how many different formats. And so part of that, well, again, you have to be realistic with what you have. But the key message here is don't wait until the end to start sharing these findings and preparing for knowledge mobilization or knowledge sharing. So in terms of knowledge mobilization, here's some things that we would often useful to think about, okay? If we think about reach plus relevance plus relationship, this equals results. And so what we've got here is a nice little diagram that kind of explains the connection between those things. So reach, are we connecting with the people the organization needs to be connected to? Relevance, to what extent does our knowledge mobilization fit the needs and interests of our audiences and stakeholders? Is it useful? Is it being used? Relationship, to what extent are we achieving the depth, breadth, and quality of engagement that we need in terms of our evaluation? If we take into account all three of these, then that's going to lead to the results. Are we making a difference? To what extent is knowledge mobilization contributing to the desired outcomes of whatever it is that we happen to be doing? Okay.
So with that, we're going to pass it over to Lori. Lori joined us for Eval just at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. This was a 6-month course that we offered where we supported mentoring organizations like yourselves and planning and implementing evaluations of their programs. Lori joined us to bolster her evaluation knowledge and skills, and in particular, apply that knowledge and skills to evaluating her program at Edmonton Public Schools. And so today, Lori's going to give you a bit of an overview of her program and why it was valuable for her to go through the steps of planning and evaluation and touch on each of those. So with that, I'll pass it to Lori.
Thanks, Kirsty. So question for you, Kirsty, do you have control of my slides, or should I present my slides?
I've got them.
Perfect. Okay, so go ahead to the first slide. And it's wonderful to be here today. Again, my name is Lori Chung, and so the program that I'm involved with, so I'm a project manager for the Academic Learning Support Program, and our program serves to link post-secondary coursework to community-based experiences within Edmonton Public Schools Division, and it's to support equitable learning experiences for all of the K through 12 students, or kindergarten through grade 12 students. And it currently runs in 44 out of 217 of our schools. So in general, how does our program work? Well, our program partners with Education 100-300 course series at the University of Alberta, and we work in partnership with Community Service Learning by placing students within Edmonton Public Schools to support the academic success of our students. So this placement requires students to complete a 20-hour placement in place of more traditional coursework. Now, that's what we do. Now, over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to walk you through what it felt like to evaluate our program, why we chose to evaluate, and the resources that we have available, as well as just my skill level, like who am I and what does evaluation mean to me? So that's where I'm going to go through. So I guess to start off with, over the last year, so exactly how Kirsty said, I sat in a seat in this course and it was Eval. And I remember the precursor to sitting in this course is we were in a meeting and it was, hey, Lori, can you do the evaluation and of this program with whatever we were scaling up? Because a semester ago, it was only in 4 schools or 3 schools, and then it was in 11 schools last year at the second semester, and now we're in 44. So our growth is like exponential. But I said, yes. And I'm like, of course I do. I can do that. I can do anything. And the reason why I did is because I've been doing this work since 2007. And I started off this program in my classroom with 2 or 3 university volunteers. They weren't placements. And then over this last decade, we've now placed 326 placement students. So it started off with 2 students, and now we're like just under 350. And well, of course, I'm going to do an evaluation because it's no longer my voice, it's our voice. So again, I'm going to say I'm a teacher. I only ran iterations from the side of my desk. And in the moment that I was asked to do this evaluation, I remember going, evaluation, what is it? And I Googled it. And I got this definition of, well, it's this systematical approach to understand merit. I'm sure it was merit and worth on these governed standards. And I'm like, oh, that's like the Alberta curriculum. Oh, and that's a unit test. I'm like, well, how does that relate to this program that we're building? And I think what it did is it just really highlighted how tremendously big the request was on me because I didn't know what I didn't know. And I guess through sitting through the process of being involved in the Eval course, it also said, well, I may not know it, but I can do it. So from there, I connected with Rebecca Gorkert, Jason Daniels, who spoke today, as well as Kirsty Keys. And they were through the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. And that was actually through a referral of the partner that we partnered with. So now I'm in connection with Alberta Mentoring Partnership, as well as the Evaluation Capacity Network. And I'm going to be absolutely honest, this is where I became empowered. I registered for this evaluation course, and it was out of professional growth in this thing that I've been attached to since 2007. And right now I'm doing my master's on it, or component of it, and I just want to see it successful. And there's so many people that are involved with it. It's no longer I, it's we, but I did it out of personal interest. So what I learned is that much of what we're already doing is evaluation. We're already doing it. So I think the biggest thing is how to integrate evaluation into everyday practices. And Jason already touched on it. Instead of making it this big burden of what it is, it's something that we do. And it's just incorporating it into what we do so we get the feedback and we can grow what we're doing. So it just really formalized a roadmap on how to get where we are now to where we want it to go. So on the next slide, it just talks about making it a habit. And really, over these next few minutes, I'm going to go through and talk about how we made it a habit. And it was about program planning and its evaluation together. And when we did it together, we built like this amazing thing that it's not that I didn't believe we could. It's just, I'm really proud of the work that we did. And I think because we were so intentional, we are serving so many people. Like, we're making a difference. Anyhow, whew, okay, didn't think I get emotional there, but we're making a difference. So what it felt like to understand on the next slide, understanding evaluation. Again, the difference between evaluation and program evaluation. Well, program evaluation is the same thing as evaluation when we went through school, except for schools, this checklist, are we doing the about a curriculum? Well, we needed to create this checklist for our program. What are the outcomes that we want to achieve? And the program evaluation is looking at, well, are we achieving those outcomes? And are we serving the people that we're serving? So I really appreciated Jason's description of developmental, formative, and summative, because we spent a long time saying, well, where are we at? Where are we at? And we landed on that we're at developmental because we're in this scaled up approach last year. And we built this amazing thing from these pilot initiatives in 3 separate schools, and there was another 4th that was doing their own thing, to this scaled up approach that had these structures that were all encompassing. So we were looking at real-time change and feedback, and we had to think through what elements of our program and building in program with iterations and revisions and saying, okay, well, this is working now. What does it look like? Because in reality, we built this program in theory based on the pilots that we ran, and then we were going to put it out and launch it into these schools where it was reality. So we needed to capture the voices of everyone involved, and we'll talk through the key stakeholders. I think that was really important for us. The neat thing is I do believe that we're moving into formative. It's about improvement because we've already went through one formal iteration. So we're looking at significant changes that we've already implemented, and now we're revising them, especially now. Like Edmonton Public has 14 catchments. Our schools are in 10 of them, like the placements. So it's no longer this small scope, it's big, and I think we're learning as we go. So we're not summative yet, even though the end of the semester we get new students. We are definitely still changing midstream. And I think what's really important is, and again, I'll talk about the key stakeholders on the next screen, is that we're just transparent with where we are and that we are in the developmental stages and we are taking our learnings and implementing for the next iteration. So even though this semester ends, and those students from the University of Alberta go, it may be final for them, but the growth of the program is not final. So on the next slide, what our focus was, and I think for me, when I was going through this learning process, I really appreciated anchoring into someone's evaluation purpose because it unpacked what I was learning. So I'm going to share our evaluation purpose, but then I'm going to talk about how it relates to theory of change. So for us, our purpose was to understand the effectiveness. So we kept on saying, well, what are we doing? Is this effective? Is this not effective? And initially we were just going to look at the tools and structures because if we can communicate effectively what the purpose of the program was, that's key, because then we're all running in the same direction. But I think after reflecting, we were like, well, it is also the effectiveness of the academic learning support program. We built all of these outcomes. We have 3 key lived experiences groups, which is the kindergarten through grade 12 students and building their capacity for academic knowledge, as well as the Edmonton Public staff, which interesting through our conversations, I don't think it was very, well, I think it was very obvious to a lot of people, but I think through the conversation for us, it really made sense. Like placing students with them, we're building leadership capacity within these groups. And then obviously the pre-service teachers, they're building their capacity with teaching. Like, let's get them out there, they're first year students, and like everybody is benefiting. It's a win-win-win scenario. Now, our goal was, again, to do the communication pieces, but I think we had to actually increase our scope to include the actual key players in it. And I think it helped us to understand how to keep our scaled up program running long term. That was our goal. So by being sensitive to the needs of those individuals, I think it doesn't mean that we weren't, we just wanted to be very realistic with how much we were biting off. But in general, it ended up being our roadmap. It was our output. It helped us to understand, are we achieving success? And can we keep it scaled up effectively long term? And really, this just speaks to the theory of change, because it essentially is a comprehensive description of, or an illustration of how and why we desire change and what it is and what do we expect it to happen in our particular context. Well, for us, this meant that we had to look at our process systematically. And I know Jason touched on this, but we had to state clearly, what does our program do? Why does it? And what are our expected outcomes? Because we couldn't measure anything if we couldn't articulate it. And the neat thing is when we joined, or when I joined this the course, we were already in the process of doing those pieces. But by putting that evaluation part and wrapping it around, it really allowed us to look at the cause and effect relationship. So is it successful? Yes, great. Then let's keep on doing that component. But if not, why not? And what inputs could be changed to positively impact the outputs that the program offers? So that evaluation purpose of the tools and structures, as well as the effectiveness of the program, really allowed us to look at the inputs and, in general, the effectiveness of how we're developing our program. Now, on the next slide here, we're going to, like I said, look at the stakeholders and the knowledge mobilization. And it's just walking through why stakeholders and how did they impact our decision making. And again, like it's not that I wasn't considering that back in 2007 and all the way up to 2018, if not 2020. It's just my scope was so small. And it was side desk, teacher side desk. I either didn't have the time to think about those things, or it just wasn't relevant at the time. But as we scaled up, it was. So on the next slide right here, our stakeholder map. So after we defined our program's purpose and our rationale, and really it ended up landing on that evaluation purpose that we just spoke about, we started to map out our key stakeholders and include individuals beyond the people with lived experiences. And again, the lived experience people were the people that the program benefited. So if you look at those concentric circles or the circles embedded, that light gray circle are the people with lived experiences. Right there is who lands, is that last bullet on my slide, is Edmonton Public students. They're going to live the program, and that includes their parents. Edmonton Public staff, they're going to live the program, and the University of Alberta education students, again, they're living it because all three of those groups are participating. But from here, and this is where some great learning happened, like I had to roll up my sleeves, and at some of the time I was just aligning my knowledge with other people that were more advanced in their evaluation process. And sometimes I was bringing them because I feel it shifted how we moved forward and it impacted what our evaluation looked like. So the sustainers are significant. We had to look at governance structures, and those governance structures for us were the University of Alberta programming. So the people that place these students or schedule these students in experiential learning or experiential learning placements through CSL, and as well our central management. through Edmonton Public, because both of those groups dictate the longevity of our program. Without the supply of those students from the university, and without Edmonton Public saying, yeah, we've got a stamp to go ahead and do placements, even though we have such a dynamic landscape here with COVID, what does it look like? And then, so the influencers are another section, which are in the darkest gray. And this is the group that I fell in. So these are the people that are on the ground that make things happen on a daily basis. As well as, so not just myself, we also had partners within community service learning, like the coordinators there and other groups. It could be a principal decision-making group, whoever it was, but it was who is making the daily decisions on an ongoing basis. And we had many groups. I'm not going to bore you with that today, but I actually don't think it's that boring. It's actually pretty exciting. But in general, thinking through our stakeholder map, it was key, because what it did is it provided us this like direction to thinking through like our planning, but it also made us go, well, what are the numbers and what is the evidence that we need to collect? Because I think what it did is it just really started to create a culture of collaboration. And we were planning evaluation questions and methods, but it's because we were responsible to all parties involved. And from there, it made us identify, well, what next steps do we need to take in order to achieve the success that we wanted? So these key stakeholders, like now, were the voice of the program. And how do we get what they need from them? Like not from them, but like how do we get what their needs are and allow their voices to come out? And as we did that, we were able to report back to our working groups, so who were building the program, our leads or our advisory group, and we could talk through the successes and findings associated with the program. And to this point, we have not presented data to our sustainers, but the neat thing is if we ever do need to, we have this solid section of data that we can. And perhaps a barrier that we may have is the time and talent of people that are putting into it as is being scaled up. But in general, if we look at the knowledge mobilization on the next slide here, I've got 2 minutes left. In order for stakeholders to feel that their voice mattered, we need to prepare for knowledge mobilization. And so this meant is, do we use an infographic? How do we understand what our target audience needs? How do we present information that's not useless, but how do we answer what makes sense? So when we were looking at talking through our goal thinking, we need to know, like I said on the previous slide, well, what is sustainable, what is not? And we were presenting to different groups. And one of the groups that we were presenting to were the 34 schools that we onboarded between now and last semester. Well, what do we say to a principal as we work forward? Or what do we say to an assistant principal as we analyze our data to determine how to best onboard these large number of principals and their assistant principals? It took understanding of the program, what it serves. It took understanding the successes and the growth points, because if they were going to come on board during this developmental stage, they needed to be informed on how to help make those decisions for the next iteration of the program. So in general, what we felt was that it was important to consider how people are affected by the successes of the program, as well as the tools and structures, and making the achievement of these the driving force behind all of our efforts. And all I can say is, like, my mind is blown. I have learned so much, and I'm so grateful for the group that I'm involved with. And I'm so pleased that I could be here, and hopefully I provided something important to you guys. Okay, I'm done. Thank you, Kirsty, it's your turn.
Thanks so much, Lori. I think that was a really great way to sort of bring all of the things we've talked about to life and demonstrate how you can use evaluation to really, like you said, make it meaningful and make it prepared to do those big scaling up things that result in making an impact for people. And so evaluation is just, you know, I think you touched nicely. It's not just a thing you have to do. It's a thing that can improve your program and make it work. So that was great. Thanks so much for joining us today. Just some pieces to wrap up. So I wanted to kind of update everybody on where this initiative is going. We touched on some of these things in the first webinar, but for those of you who weren't there, we've got pre-eval running. So these are our monthly lunchtime webinars. As a part of pre-eval, you might have seen when you registered there was an option to complete a survey. You may have already done it, but if not, we would really appreciate if you did the survey now. We're going to do a pre-survey and a post-survey when we're done all 8. And this is just us evaluating our teachings on evaluation. So it's really meta, but it allows us to sort of continue to do what we do and improve it to meet your needs as best as possible. So that link is in the chat there. The other pieces I wanted to touch on are the availability of individual coaching hours and our online platform. And these kind of go hand in hand. So right now we're just in the processes of finalizing our online Moodle website with Alberta Mentoring Partnership. On this website, you will find different resources, upcoming events, discussion boards, and a community of practice with other people. As well, our recordings of our webinars will eventually be moved from YouTube to this website. And I'm going to give you a quick look at it. I encourage you to put the website in your browser now and bookmark it so you don't lose it. I'm just going to share my screen in a different way here. Okay. So this website you guys may be familiar with here. This is where you went to register for pre-eval. If you come back to this website at a later time, you will find our next set of webinars in January and February become available, and you can sign up for our evaluation specific newsletter to make sure that you know when those registrations are released. That's at albertamentors.ca/eval. The other website is eval.albertamentors.ca. So it's a little different, but kind of the same. And I'll pop that in the chat here. So if you go to this one, you'll be able to, what you'll see here is this screen, and you can go to log in and you can create an account. And once you create that account, your screen will look like this, and you can get into the evaluation course. And as you can see, we're going to have a bunch of different sections where we will upload resources, definitions, videos, as well as discussion boards where you can ask questions about different topics about your evaluations or things you're not quite sure about, but maybe someone else in the mentoring sector who's doing an evaluation might have a similar experience. And we will be helping monitor those discussion boards as well. The other thing that will come up on here will be an ability to sign up for individual coaching hours. Those will be 1-hour time slots that you can book if you are an AMP partner. If you're not sure if you're a partner, take a look at their website. And if you are a partner, great. You are able to sign up for 3 of these sessions per year. And these are really for people who are planning or conducting an evaluation and just need a little bit of support in talking through some of those pieces. So you can bring that in, come discuss that with us, and we will hopefully be able to support you in that. And so that is everything we are doing right now. Here is the website to the Moodle. And if you do have any questions, we haven't left very much time for that, but I hope that what we talked about was quite useful. So you can reach me at kirsty@ualberta.ca, which I will also put in the chat. And you can find the Evaluation Capacity Network at evaluationcapacitynetwork.com.ca. Don't remember, Jason, do you remember? Let me type it in my thing here and see what comes up. .com, evaluationcapacitynetwork.com. All right, and I don't know, are all my links going to everybody? I might be posting only to the hosts, so I will pop these now. Thank you, Lori. Let me do that again, and before you log off, you can grab these links. And if anyone has any questions at this time, please feel free to send me a chat here. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks so much, everybody. Great, looks like those links are going through now. Perfect. And for anybody watching the recording, when you apply for your webinar certificate of completion, the code will be eval number 2. So eval #2. everybody.